Today's guest offers a compelling perspective on how we might be fundamentally misunderstanding generative AI tools like ChatGPT. Rather than trying to make it fit existing paradigms, such as databases or search engines, he argues that ChatGPT represents something entirely new. It's best understood as a confabulator, an engine that constructs narratives or stories rather than retrieving facts. But this doesn't mean it's flawed. In fact, understanding ChatGPT in this way opens up exciting new possibilities for how we can harness its true potential.
One of the things that define us as human beings is our ability and our love of the narrative. We are all basically storytellers. We're all basically wanting to either live within a story that we can embellish with our own stories, or we are people that want to create stories. We want to create worlds. And that is something that I think generative AI is especially adept for.
Please don't forget to hit the subscribe and like buttons. Your engagement is what makes these podcasts possible. And we have a number of exciting episodes coming up in the following weeks that tackle topics such as AI and misinformation, and AI and higher education.
This is the OpenAI Changes Everything podcast with your host, Stephen Walther, where we explore how OpenAI is transforming the future of humanity.
Hey everyone, welcome to the show. I am so excited today. I have Kurt Cagle, who's joining us from Mercer Island, near Seattle. Welcome, Kurt. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And I just want to start with a brief bio. I should also mention I've known Kurt for several years now. Man, it was I forget how long ago we met. It was something like 15 years ago. It's a long time ago when we first met. But to provide his bio, Kurt Cagle is the visionary editor-in-chief of the Cagle Report, a cutting-edge weekly LinkedIn newsletter that dives deep into the latest trends and innovations shaping the digital workplace. With a career spanning decades at the intersection of writing, data, and emerging technology, Kurt has built a reputation for providing thought-provoking insights that challenge the status quo. And again, welcome. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. I should actually use that. That's a nice bio. Mine are usually I'm Kurt Cagle. You come and read my newsletter, and so I'm impressed.
No, well, I just have to say, I mean, I've spent a lot of time over the past couple days going through your previous posts, reading through your newsletter. It's been a lot of fun. I mean, you are a very opinionated person, which I enjoy, and I like, there's a long sort of history going back. You also have those occasional ones where you make predictions for the next year, which I also really enjoyed going back and reading your 2024 predictions. But the one that really caught my attention recently was the one where you said, you can correct me here if I'm getting it completely wrong, but let me throw it out here. The newsletter that you sent off recently where you said basically everyone is fundamentally misunderstanding generative AI. And you said, my takeaway is we're trying to fit it into an existing paradigm that we have where it doesn't really fit very well at all. And that we really should be thinking of this new, all the ChatGPT stuff, all the Claude stuff, all the Gemini stuff. We should be thinking of it as a confabulator instead of, sort of our traditional notions of using an algorithm. So let me stop there. Am I capturing that correctly?
Yeah,
Do you think we all have it wrong?
I do, but this is not even all that unusual whenever you have kind of a new paradigm emerge in programming. When the internet came out in I think 95, 96 time frame, and it got to the point where it was getting to be moving beyond a few people who understood, hey, yeah, we have a mode of communications here that's a little bit different than everything else. And my first experience with that was actually back in '92. and I saw this web page, new paradigm, but this web page about a particular university, and it had a picture and it had a bio, and I said, "Oh, well, that's exciting." And then proceeded to move on to something else at the demo I was at, because it was kind of like, well, yeah, it looks like a very fancy way of being able to bring up a an advertisement. Um, and when the web first came out, you had a lot of that. Well, what exactly is it? And it changed kind of on a daily basis. At one point it was, well, it's a search engine, or it was a way of finding things, and it was a way of being able to tell people what porn you had on your computer, which I always found to be very interesting. And then it kind of emerged and it became, well, it's a magazine, and it's a news magazine or newspaper, and then it's TV, but it's not TV, it's
Yeah.
something completely different. And it took a while for us to actually get to the point where we just accepted it as being the internet. And,
Yeah.
that particular paradigm is something that I see happening now with generative AI in particular, where we're essentially now looking at this and saying, okay, well, we know what various things are. We have applications, and applications have buttons and tabs and things like that. We have databases which store data. We have games and other things that allow us to kind of get into immersive environments, and those are kind of new, but novel anyway. Although they've been around for
Yeah.
decades now. But no one really knows what to do with AI, and people come to it and think, well, first of all, it's a database. It's a database that allows me to get information about anything. And that's not really quite true. It's it's a way of being able to take a lot of information, literally, petabytes and petabytes of information, scrambling them up, trying to find some sense out of the words that come out of it. It's a lot like a Ouija board in that respect. Um, and what it comes up with then is essentially saying, okay, you sent a prompt that basically tells me I need to go look for things that are sort of kind of like this, but in response based upon all this petabytes of information. And it goes and it does these, big, hairy calculations across, n-dimensional tensor whatevers, and comes back with a set of responses that then gets, further refined by transformers, and takes that information and dumps it to your screen. And that is
So let
sort of
me,
kind of like what a
sorry.
database is, but it's not. So go
Yeah.
on.
Oh, no, no. I guess what caught my attention is, well, there's several things. First, I've interviewed a lot of, like, at this point, startups and companies who their whole value proposition is, we're going to use AI to create better databases or search engines or all of that. So it's a little scary to think maybe they're on the wrong track here. But the thing that
I
really sort of
absolutely they're on the
caught
wrong track. Okay, go on.
they're on the okay. But the thing that really caught my eye was your use of the word. It's a confabulator,
Yeah,
and that really we should think of generative AI as confabulation. And I don't. I mean, my background with the word confabulation is I've come across it in like the context of neuroscience and philosophy when talking about like split brain patients, or forget the name of the syndrome the alcohol syndrome where you forget things and you in those contexts, confabulation basically means, making things up, not in a deceitful way, not in a way that's, actually intentionally lying, but in a way that doesn't really know. It's just sort of generating this stuff. You have these gaps and you just fill it in
yeah,
with these different neurological conditions. And so it kind of struck me. I mean, I thought that was a very interesting way to look at how, sort of ChatGPT functions. And it is very different from, I think what I'm interpreting you saying is, look, whenever there's a new technology, we use existing paradigms. If the internet was classified ads or advertising or maybe newspaper initially, but then we discover it's something in and of itself, but it takes us a long time to get there. But it sounds like you're saying something even like stronger in the case of generative AI, that we're kind of like I don't know, misaligning it with our previous paradigms that doesn't really fit in very well, going back to like a database, because we do know that, things like ChatGPT do make things up. It tells stories. That's what it's good at. And
Yeah.
maybe it's not the most appropriate technology to use as a front end for a database. Although I should tell you again, I've talked to a lot of like companies at this point where that's what they're trying to do. They're saying, hey, like for example, that's the whole value proposition of what's it called? Glean.
Right.
Glean is an enterprise-wide search engine that uses a large language model to be able to, connect all the disparate information across an organization, and they see it as so. I guess my question is, is it wrong to try to use it in these ways? Do you think that this will ultimately end in, frustration and despair? Or is it just
Uh,
this isn't necessarily the best way to like, think about this technology?
I think it's a bit of both. Uh, the problem that you have with an LLM is that you're basically saying I'm looking for similarity of patterns. And that concept of being able to find that pattern matching, which it's very good at, is something that's actually fairly intrinsic to what the system itself does. It basically says I have received back chunks of tokens, essentially decomposed chunks of information, and I've turned them into some kind of a response. Doesn't necessarily know what that response is. That sense, and one of the questions kind of talks about self-awareness. I'll get to that in a bit. But once you have that information back, it you're missing a lot of the fundamental pieces that you have with most databases. That's to say, it's difficult to maintain provenance. It's difficult to know where the information came from. It's difficult to know the accuracy of the information. It's difficult to be able to say, I want to make a change because what's in here is wrong, and have that
Yeah.
information then update in a reasonable fashion. It's non-transactional. All of those pieces that we tend to associate with databases are typically are lacking here. And the only real reason why we tend to look at it from the database perspective is actually kind of demonstrated from what happened about a decade ago, with Hadoop and big data. Because the paradigm is actually very, very similar. A lot of similarity there. In about 20, I first saw Hadoop in 2009. It was around 2013, 14 that you saw, a lot of the big Horton and other, companies that essentially took what was um, a pretty good MapReduce paradigm for doing distributed grid-based programming, um, across networks or across a distributed data store. And that idea, the notion of adapting MapReduce, which goes way, way back, that's an old paradigm. But the idea of doing that essentially in the basis of cloud computing was a relatively new concept. And you can do some very interesting things with Hadoop that you can't otherwise do because most systems at that point were not really yet fully cloud aware of one another. Because of that, it was useful, but it was useful for a very specific purpose and a very specific reason. And it was really not all that terribly useful from a monetization standpoint, because you're talking processes, and processes generally don't sell very well. So what ended up happening was that a lot of marketing people came in and said, no, we're actually a database. And we save things and we do things with this information and all that, but all the same things that I was just talking about with when you start talking about where our problems are with LLMs today, to a significant extent, also extend back to what happened with the Hadoop. And ultimately, the problem was that you took a very good paradigm for doing MapReduce operations across a distributed center, and you turned it into a really bad database. And that's what happened. It was slow, it was inefficient, it wasn't standardized. There was, people would adapt it saying, look, I'm doing Hadoop, and oh, this thing is just dog slow. And I can't do anything. And you know where the primary usage of Hadoop is today? It's basically to cache all of that information that is required by the government, where they say, we expect you to save our data for 5 years. And it doesn't really matter how efficient that is, because it's only written once. And then it can be forgotten. And it's really good at that. But it's lousy as a day-to-day interactive database. What you see right now with ChatGPT is they've kind of made that same realization that it does some very interesting things, but it's not interesting things enough to justify the price tag that is currently being expected of it in terms of investment. And so it's become a database. And it's not a very good database for precisely those reasons I outlined.
So, okay. So if I'm understanding that, I love the analogy with Hadoop. You're saying that, understandably, people are latching on to generative AI to fulfill existing use cases. And we already have in our mind, databases, search engines. We understand that. But you're saying that it's not necessarily a good fit, because for all the reasons that you just talked about, which is a little, I know that, OpenAI has Search GPT, of course, and there's Perplexity AI, and there's lots of attempts right now to start using large language models as search engines.
Right.
And, and there's a lot of, fear and hand wringing over, is it going to replace Google long term? Is this is it going to create a wall between people and, news sources like Newsweek and all that, because it will become the universal sort of interface to all of human knowledge, because it's, it's a nice conversational interface. It's a lot more natural. I'm finding I'm using Google much less. I'm using either Perplexity or I'm using, ChatGPT much more, just because it does such a great job of, summarizing and not wasting my time. And I do that. And I know, getting back to your original point about, the confabulation, about it making stuff up, I do sometimes get nervous, and it does completely make stuff up some of the time, which is really frustrating. But so I guess I'm wondering, let me ask you this. Do you actively use things like ChatGPT to do things like searches and things like that?
All the
Is
time.
it something that, okay. And so you think it's appropriate to use it for information retrieval? It's just, your point is, it's just not, in terms of the products that people are promoting right now, where they're trying to get investments, thinking of it in terms of a database or a search engine isn't really the right way to be pursuing investments. And you just said that there's probably going to be a market reaction eventually to sort of mischaracterizing the main sort of use case for generative AI. Am I understanding you correctly?
To a certain extent, yes. Now, I
Okay.
there's you kind of slid in there from database to search engine, and there's a little bit of a difference. Absolutely, what you have with ChatGPT is that it is at its core not all that terribly different from the way that we build search engines or built search engines even 5 years ago. It's the mechanism. There's a neural network in there, and we've kind of moved to neural networks from about 2010 on, that it does the search, does basically the retrieval into a vector database, which is what, when you get right down to it, that's what an LLM is. It's a giant vector database. And that vector database is something that has been tweaked and modified to take large amounts of data, large amounts of content. And it's actually, it's actually better when that content is not structured. Because non-structured content, or at least not actively data structured content that we tend to think about when we talk about data, is much more likely to reflect human characteristics of speech, and is much more likely then to be able to provide responses that come back. I had one client I worked with for a while who was looking at doing RFPs. And, if I
So
feed
this is
enough
like request for proposal process for
request for
like
proposals,
government, government, like sort of contracts or other types of contracts that they're trying to. Yep.
exactly. And they fed their LLM the RFPs, and it came back sounding like a bureaucrat describing how you basically do an RFP.
Yeah.
And it was boring as hell.
Yeah.
Because there was no variation there. There was one type of information that was used predominantly, but the reason that you were trying to be able to do it in the first place was because you wanted to be able to say, hey, I'm wanting to make this an easier proposition. So, ultimately what helped there was to actually go in and throw stuff that wasn't RFP based, just simply so that the engine had enough of a hook to be able to extract meaningful conversational content. It doesn't automatically magically generate it. You have to have that source. And, if the more variety you have, the better, to a certain point. Now, there's a kind of a flip side to that, which is that if you get too large, your efficiency actually goes down, largely because of the fractal nature of the information that gets stored. And another analogy I like to use is that of a watershed. If you have a watershed, you basically can think of it as I drop a ball of water, and for conceptualization purposes, I drop a small ball of water, and that ball will either stay where it is or it'll start rolling downhill until it gets into a collection or a stream of other balls of water moving along the line of gravity. And so if you think of a watershed as being essentially this fractal structure that kind of digs into the space, you can have overlapping watersheds. You can have watersheds, a lot of places actually do, along the edges of watersheds, where I can drop a ball 5 centimeters over and it's going to fall into a different watershed because that just happens to be the way that gravity tends to fall.
Okay, so I'm on like a hill,
You're on a
and
hill.
depending on where I drop this ball of water, it's going to, just small variations in the hill, like low mounds and stuff, might make a big difference about where that water ends up, which
Exactly.
watershed it gets down to. Okay, got it.
It's a pachinko at a very global scale.
Right. Right.
So that problem is actually, I think, one of the problems that you have when you start getting into these large whales of LLMs, because what happens is that you get these watersheds, and those watersheds mean that you then become much more susceptible to initial conditions than they would be in smaller environments or smaller data sets. So, that's actually something that is now emerging as we get these larger and larger systems. They actually become stupider. Not because they're
Huh.
actually becoming less efficient, but because the potential for going off on a tangent goes much, much higher the more information you have after you reach that critical mass where they start talking to one another. So there's kind of an upper limit to what you can reasonably do with an LLM before it goes, before you get to the point where it begins to hallucinate more rather than less.
So
And I
that
think,
surprises me,
oh,
because I would think that, the more kind of information that's coming in, I always think of, what is it? It's the there's a theorem. I forget what the name of the theorem right now, but basically, it's more bad information cancels out other bad information and averages out. And, over time you get closer and closer to the truth, as long as you have enough information that's sort of balancing each other.
yeah, I mean
And I,
that that theorem, there's I think it was the tipping point
yeah,
um, that this was actually elucidated with, but it's actually one of the differences that you run into, when the wisdom of the comments, and I don't remember exactly which of those this came from, but I know that essentially what this is the way that stochastics and pure stochastic systems work. When you talk about when you talk about statistics and statistical phenomena, you basically can say, okay, in a purely independent system, then yes, you can basically say everything happens to fall on a nice normal distribution curve. And because of that, you can effectively say that over time, biases
yeah,
tend to cancel out. The wisdom of the the wisdom of the commons, or the wisdom of the crowd. And that actually holds true so long as everything is largely independent.
right,
When things aren't independent, however, that begins to shift from being a Gaussian distribution or a normal distribution, and instead increasingly becomes more like a power law. And a
yeah,
power law basically is very big peak, and then it dies off pretty quickly in a long tail. And that is essentially a reflection of increasing interconnectedness of a network. The more that you have, and we're dealing with networks here. When you get right down to it, all of these are networks. But as you get those networks becoming increasingly connected and increasingly dependent upon initial conditions, that's when you run into issues where, in essence, what we think of as the statistics involved begin to break down because they're no longer following what we consider independent distributions. And I
okay,
realize,
that
and I'm
makes
not a
sense.
mathematician, so I know enough math to get myself into serious hot water, but it is something that I keep coming back to, and that is that information is not independent. There's normally
Yeah,
corollaries that connect information, and because of that, we have to be careful when we're dealing with stochastic systems to understand that they're not quite as stochastic as we want to believe.
interesting. Okay. Um, well, I'd like to, if it's okay, I'd like to move back to the whole thing about confabulators.
Sure.
And because I thought you had an interesting, you talked about how there's this perception right now that, and I think everyone's claiming this, that we'll be able to use large language models as push button kind of operations to be able to do things like, automatically generate pictures and videos and, the whole Hollywood strike that happened a year or two ago, where the
Right.
writers were demanding, we can't have these, large language models generating all of our scripts for our television shows because we'll be out of work. And I know lots of people are worried right now in the film industry over, how easy it will be with, oh man, the latest Sora videos are amazing. The latest, why am I telling you? I've looked at some of your videos. They're very cool, the stuff that you've worked on. And I, I mean, so I guess what I was curious about was you said that I think what you were saying was that that's not something that's again a misrepresentation of the technology, or it's not. You express skepticism, at least some skepticism, that we really will get to the place where those fears are warranted, because it's not necessarily true that will be, removing all that effort. You express skepticism if we'll ever get to that push button sort of point where people
Yeah.
are generating, full Hollywood movies or entire books. Or I was curious about that.
Well, I mean, let me take the videos as an example.
Yeah,
What I have found, and I suspect this is true for anyone that's been doing, the video work for a while, and this I think applies pretty much universally. Realistically, what happens is that you create a video. You say, here's my prompt. And it does a pretty good version. I mean, there's some really nice things. I use a lot. I use Kling, for example, KLING.ai for my video generation. It's a nice system. But
I
it is
saw you
also,
had the one with, what was it, Elspeth Godwin, that you did the
yeah,
you did the video of that, and I was actually really impressed. I mean, she was talking, she was lip syncing. It was, I mean, it wasn't perfect. I mean, it was sort of like overly perfect in the sense that sometimes, like, I don't know, AI generated videos are, but if you didn't look super closely and you didn't look, I mean, it all came together in a pretty convincing way.
but it also took me about an hour of magic
Yeah.
push button to be able to get there. And I think that's the point that I'm
To
trying to
create
make
the
here.
10-second video, or
That
yeah.
that 10-second video took me an hour to create.
Right.
And the
Yeah.
reason for that, and it's generally true, um, these systems are basically highly dependent upon the quality of the prompt, and they are also highly dependent upon what I call iterative development. So when I create something, that little piece, was little. It actually didn't take all that much to be able to generate the content. But what did I do? I actually have about 10 loops of 5-second videos where each one was just not quite what I wanted. In some cases, it was dramatically not what I wanted. I had one where the character started laughing maniacally, and I almost ended up using it. And I said, no, not for this. Um,
So it almost
there
sounds like a
are
bad actress that you got. You hired a bad actress. She's
You
not
hired a bad
following
actor.
she's not doing her role.
Exactly, and that tends to be the problem that you run into with this, is that it's not so much that you can't generate. You can, and you get some incredible effects, but you have to go in with the expectation that it's not going to be one push button and you're suddenly there. And this it actually gets back to the whole notion of is this art? And
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been doing artwork for probably my entire life in the background. I'm not bad, as an artist. I'm not. I won't claim I'm good, but but when I create something, inevitably my first thought is, okay, that's pretty good, but this sucks. And so I have to go back and I have to redraw it. Now, there's a
Right.
certain degree of in order to be able to improve something, you basically work it and work it and work it, and you will never find a point where you're actually completely 100% satisfied with it. But that successive refinement is actually a very critical part of going in from what is raw material, the footage of this bad actor laughing maniacally or suddenly turning
Right.
into this monster, to okay, I'm trying to take this and I'm taking this, I'm fitting together the pieces and hope that I have enough pieces to effectively then put together enough of a scene to make it seem cohesive. And when you get right down to it, it's basically what a film editor does.
Yeah.
A film editor will work with a producer, and they'll sit there in a room and they'll look at, I've got a bank of 20 hours or 50 hours of video snippets, and most of them will end up on the floor. You take these pieces, you basically do some editing to make this look like it's a natural transition. You do other things like that. You basically have to build this up. And that editing process takes time. So what you're doing is you're replacing the creation process, which, we've been doing that for years. We've been decades even. When Photoshop first came out, everyone in the industry just absolutely decried it. They said, this is awful. It's going to ruin artists and no one's going to use it. And we can't even think of this as being legitimate work. And to be honest, I know very few artists, professional artists, that don't use something like that in their day-to-day work, because otherwise it takes too friggin' long to be able to get something
Right.
that you want to get to published. Now, this is different from someone basically creating a painting for hanging up in an exhibition. And it's different primarily in that what you are creating is an artifact. You're creating something that is essentially, I have created something that has solidity, it has existence, and it's something that if someone comes in and says, oh, I like your work, can I buy an original? You can say, well, here's what I have. Now, you
Right.
go digital and you lose that. You lose that ability to actually say, the best you can do is hit a button and a printer somewhere will give you a nice glycine or something like that. But that's
Right.
really where you end up going. So I don't see that actually affecting most artists. I know there's a lot of artists out there who are now very actively working with this. Some of them are
Yep.
really bad. Some of them are okay, not bad, and some of them are just absolutely jaw-dropping in terms of what they're
Yeah.
being able to do. But that's because they're doing this process of successive refinement using the tools they have. That's where I see AI going. Now, there was a
So
recent...
it's, yeah, go ahead.
sorry, go on. There was a
No, yeah,
recent introduction that OpenAI did with Canvas, and I did a review of that a couple days ago. And as an editor, Canvas sucks.
yeah,
Just simply because it's not very smart. But that really is beside the point. It's a beta product. I understand it's a beta
right.
product, and trying to be able to read people's workflow process is not an easy process. So I'm looking at it and saying, this is not bad for a first attempt. It's going to get
Yeah.
refined. I understand that. But the key thing here is that what Canvas does is allows for writers to actually write rather than simply
Right.
press a button and get a response back. And then you can
It's
persist that
designed for
writing.
iteration.
It's
Yeah.
designed for iteration. And that's huge. Because if you
Yeah.
can actually get the bugs worked out for that, then you basically have a mechanism that allows people to get back into the process of being able to use it as a tool rather than as a producer.
I was wondering, I mean, when I was reading that, there seems to be, I've detected a general theme from these podcast interviews. A lot of people have talked about sort of this transition from being individual contributors to being more like managers to being more like, like treating generative AI as, as delegating work over to it. It does sort of like the initial drafts. I mean, this has come up with, I interviewed someone about AI in education, and he was talking about how students use AI. And this is, how students in the future are going to have to learn how to write essays by starting with AI stuff, generated stuff, and then editing it, going through over and over again. And even the VP of AI at Turnitin, which is the largest AI detection company. I did an interview with him a couple months ago, and he was saying, yeah, he thinks this is the direction that we'll go into. It's crazy to try to prevent students from using AI to generate content, but we're going to have to get used to now students thinking of a new role, that they're in the role of now, they're acting like managers in a way. They're going off and they're asking this independent entity to generate first drafts for them, and then they're giving criticism back. What I thought was interesting in your newsletter article is you were talking about something I hadn't heard before, but like that might end up resulting in less productivity gains than we might otherwise think we'd get from AI, because a lot of this is shifting kind of the time spent on projects away from sort of generating the original, book or essay or video or picture, and shifting it more into sort of the review, the editorial process, which is, as you just said, I mean, editors, that's a different set of skills. It might take the same amount of time. And so I was curious about that. I mean, so do you think that we just won't get the productivity gains that, they just added support for AI in Canva, for example, or really common tool for quick digital, sort of picture creation that people use all the time
Right.
for blogs. Do you think that the productivity gains that we're expecting to get from AI are being exaggerated, and we'll just end up shifting all the work into the editorial process instead of into the content creation process?
I think it'll shift some. I think that there are going to be productivity gains, with the caveat that when you talk about productivity, you basically are talking about improving human function.
Yeah.
And this is an important distinction, and I want to get to it. I study organizations, and especially things like Taylorism, and a lot of that original notion of where does productivity come from.
Yep.
And one of the things that comes out of that is the realization that, look, we're at a point right now where the operations that typically had been done by humans are now being done in trillionths and quadrillionths of a second.
Right.
No, so far faster. You kind of look at it as saying, okay, well, if I had the age of the universe, I might be able to get this done for everything in approximately what I can get out of a good GPU in 5 seconds worth of work.
Right.
So we need to be careful when we talk about productivity to understand that what that actually means is that we're not actually creating or need to create more things or more processes. How many PowerPoint slide presentations do you need to make a month?
Oh,
I
please,
figure
please
that
make it zero.
exactly. But the point is that a
Right.
lot of organizations, they live on PowerPoint, and they're going to live on PowerPoint. But
Right. I
even
know. I
so,
know. I know.
you're talking 2, 3, maybe 4 a month. Well, the productivity gains that you get from the computations, from the automation, are so significantly faster than human capabilities that they effectively are zero. Which means that what
Yeah.
becomes what ends up becoming the bottleneck is essentially the human activity. And
Yeah.
so, in a sense, that's where, as we're looking at this, that's really where we're dealing with the that's really where we're dealing when we talk about productivity gains. It's not, okay, you're going to get more things done. It's you're effectively getting more. You're making your staff essentially able to work with less impedance. But that actually brings up another point, and it kind of gets back to jobs all over again. We're at a stage now where, we think that there's a lot to do in a given week. And, I look at my schedule and I go, I've got interviews and meetings and code that I need to write and things like that. But the reality is that for most of us, it's, work has become episodic. It has become something where we do a thing, and then we're done with that. We do another thing. And there's usually a fairly significant gap in between doing thing one and thing two. So what happens, and where we're kind of at this stage, is that notion of productivity itself is actually, I think, becoming fairly destructive, because you cannot get to a point where you're saying, okay, we're going to take all of the human factors out, which are causing these, these chasms of time. And, if we can just increase our productivity a little bit more, then we'll just get more done. Well, no, you'll get the same amount done, because the really hard things are already being automated. And most of what we're dealing with productivity is basically improving the social interactions. And that AI is not really going to make that much of a difference on.
So I'm trying to get my head around that, because I think if I understand what you're saying is, I mean, once upon a time, like my grandfather did this. He worked in a canning factory, and he, took fruit and made sure they got in the cans, and he did a certain number per hour, and that was how he was paid. And they tried to make it more efficient, and really, really simple universe. Boring job, but it was fine. And then now you're saying that, we can try to measure the productivity gains we're getting now, but the problem is that, and I'm like this too. I mean, you do so many very different activities, and a lot of the time consuming parts of the activities that you're doing for work have to do with getting buy-in from others, influencing people, getting all the sort of social interaction, so that you get sort of like agreement to move forward on something, or you get the necessary support that you need to be able to move forward with a new product feature. And that's not something that can be easily like replaced by AI. Sure, generating the PowerPoint, AI could help with. It can create prettier looking pictures in your PowerPoint, and maybe make your, case a little more convincing, your pitch in your PowerPoint document. But it's not going to change the really critical step of getting buy-in from the right sort of leadership to be able to move forward on that. And so that's where we won't get immediate productivity gains from AI, because that's not something we want to outsource to AI at this point. Am I capturing that correctly?
Well, I think it's both, do we want to, and, is there any benefit? Because it comes down to, we're entering into the age of intentional programming. And, intentional programming basically means I have an intent and I want to accomplish that intent.
Yeah.
When we talk, and programming here doesn't necessarily mean writing code. It's just, I have a certain set of things that I want to accomplish, and these are basically the tools that I'm going to use to accomplish those. But rather than me manually, and, always manually, but rather than me manually operating these tools, I'm now increasingly delegating that to other tools to be able to accomplish the same things. And so, that intent is, I think, very key to thinking about where we're going in the future. I mean, to a certain extent, we're looking at things that there's a lot of bias. And I mean, not in a statistical sense, but in a social sense. There's a lot of bias towards manual work, which I think is really unfair. And it really kind of comes down to, the more that you do things with your hands, the less value you actually have. The most value is basically, am I making somebody money? Then it becomes, am I helping people help them make money? And then, it kind of works down this pyramid, so that by the time you get to the people that are actually doing the bulk of the work, their work, which is hard, is
Yeah.
largely considered to be manual, and by extension is not something that I can press a button and get a solution on.
Right. Right. So that's a funny way of it, but I think that's true. So you're saying that, like, the C++ programmer is because they're on the bottom of the money making hierarchy, they're seen more as laborers rather than, necessarily, I don't know, in the same, and that makes sense. And I would like to ask you about the concrete case of coding, computer science, programming, because I mean that's sort of like, I know, a lot of people have high hopes for generative AI in reducing the number of programming jobs. There's a lot of people making predictions. Was it Devon is the full, sort of AI. OpenAI was promoting it when they came out with, Strawberry, with the latest version of OpenAI. They had a talk from the CEO of Devon come
Right.
out and talk about, oh no, Devon not only codes, Devon does all the adjacent stuff to coding. Devon will go off and run the command prompts and will, write the unit tests and, do everything involved in building an application, interact with Jira. It's an actual, full programmer, and eventually, you'll have that. And I've heard Sam Altman give talks before where he talks about, in the not so distant future, everyone can have basically like an army of developers ready on call at all times, because that's what AI will give you. It'll give you all these agents who are able to act the same way as programmers. I'm curious what you think about that, because that's, purely replacing programmers. It's moving. I think it fits your theme. You were just talking about, intent is really the thing that's going to be driving things in the future and sort of getting higher in that hierarchy. Is there going to be a point where, we end up firing all the programmers? Hopefully there'll be some product managers around still trying to figure out what to do, but because it can be translated so easily off to these AI systems, it'll do the programming for us. Are we going to get to that point, and do we want to get to that point?
Um, there was, trying to think how best to answer that. I remember having a conversation a couple of years ago now with a couple of people, I think out of Israel, that were talking about, hey, they had basically managed to develop, or were developing, a system that would manage to replace software developers. And eventually, it's going to replace everyone in an organization, right? And I said, well, okay, so what you're telling me is that you now have something that's going to replace yourself. No, do you really like your job so little that you want to get rid of your revenue stream? I mean, that's a perfectly valid thing. The programmers do it all the
Right.
time. But
Right.
the problem that you have with that is that a programmer, we tend to classify programmers largely on the basis of what skills they have. And that's true in general, but I think in programmers it's particularly true. And so we talk about an AI programmer or a C++ programmer or an HTML programmer. And then there was people that were making a lot of good money as an HTML programmer, not too terribly long ago.
Yeah.
In most cases, there's actually two different types of people that you're dealing with there. One are people who essentially have learned enough about the rudiments of programming that they can effectively write code in a certain language to solve a very limited set of problems. And, though that language may very well depend upon what kind of domain you're dealing with, what kind of solutions. But there's a second set of programmers who basically are problem solvers. And that's their real job. My job is to solve a problem.
Yep.
And that is not going to change. All that changes is basically the complexity of the problem that you're dealing with. And I think that realistically, what's going to happen is that as we build up the complexity of the stack, that frees up these developers from having to worry about all of the little mundane crap that you have to do
Yeah.
as a developer. It used to be garbage collection, then we automated garbage collection. It used to be,
Right.
okay, we have a compiler, and now that compiler is deeply embedded in a piece of machinery, and we don't even think about it anymore. But we do have to deal with the complexities of saying, I have a very complex system. I liken the term, and I've used this term before, programmers are complexity engineers. And they basically exist to primarily turn complex problems into something that can be handled by simple means. Now, that means that if you have older skills, yes, those will become obsolete. If I don't program in Fortran anymore. It's been a long time since I've programmed in Fortran, because there's frankly little reason for it. I can do it in the
Yeah.
same thing in any number of languages nowadays. And so, but we get so fixated upon the skill sets that we don't understand that, look, the need for being able to deal with complex problems is not going to go away. If anything, it's going to become more critical, because
Okay.
what
Let me
you
let me
have
try
now.
to
Okay,
let
so
me try to
go on.
summarize. So what I'm hearing, just want to check my understanding here, is there are kind of like boots on the ground, low level programmers who are experts at, I don't know, Java or a
C++
particular
or whatever, yeah.
language, and they're not necessarily like systems thinking. They're not thinking in terms of architecture or taming complexity. And those jobs will probably go away because, generative AI is already, Microsoft Copilot, or I guess it's called GitHub Copilot, is pretty good already at, like spewing out a lot of boilerplate code, and it can do a lot of that stuff. And then there's sort of higher level sort of complexity tamers, who have a specialized skill set in trying to design sort of complex systems. And that's different from, say, a product manager. A product manager is more focused on figuring out business value and the why, and what to build, but they don't have that particular training or the experience thinking about how to build complex systems. So the idea is that there'll still be in the future this division between sort of product and engineering, but it won't look like how it looks now. It won't be like, the engineers have like, they have the arcane knowledge of how to, create such and such in a particular language. What they have is more like they've gotten that experience about how to build systems that are dependable, that won't fall over, that are adaptable to the future, all the good stuff that you want in a good system. And so there'll still be that division. It's just that the sort of low level hands-on skill. And so I guess the question is, I mean, if all of those people right now who are going through these computer science programs, what are they like? Not is this a waste of time for them? Should they be focusing more on, I don't know, architecture, or would you suggest that they start like thinking about a different career direction at this point?
That's a good question. And, I,
Because my niece is just graduating from computer
yeah.
science, and so I know she's very concerned with the way the world is changing right now.
Well, I think this is more a question of how we're teaching computer science. And this is actually a concern that educators have, and I've had these discussions several times myself. When you teach computer science, what do you actually teach? You teach how to work with algorithms. You teach how to work with data systems. You teach how
Yeah.
to work with, increasingly with iterative, event-driven systems, and continue along in that same general path. These are not necessarily to teach skills. When I was in school, I learned PL1. I have not written a line of PL1 in my life since I graduated.
Right.
They are intended to teach an understanding of the mechanisms involved in problem solving, and specifically technical problem solving. There are ways of being able to say, and I think this gets lost in a lot of curricula, but there are ways of basically saying, look, you need to, the enemy that you're facing is complexity, and the world doesn't understand complexity. Complexity is something that the average person has real trouble with. And I think over at Cooper Union, I had a conversation, I had an interview with him several years ago. And he liked to use the airplane metaphor. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard this before or not, but it's actually a really good idea, a really good way of thinking about the mindsets involved. Average person comes up the ramp into an airplane, and there's a stewardess there, or a steward there. And that person says, okay, do you want to sit in the cabin, or do you want to sit in the pilot's cabin, or in the cockpit?
Yeah.
The average person will take one look at the cockpit and say, oh no, I want to sit in the cabin where it's nice and everything is brought to me and I don't have to deal with this, and I get free booze if I happen to be in the right seats, and I get really bad food if I don't. But, it's still preferable than having to deal with that. The programmer comes in and their first thought is, oh, wow, toys! And immediately will jump into the cabin and start pressing buttons to figure out what's going on. That's the mindset that you have. But the key there is that they are people who like complexity, and they want to basically figure out a way of taming it. And I think your complexity tamer is a good example of that. That mindset does not go away. And if it goes away, then we're done. At that point, it's not even worth talking about computer science, because it'll be dead in a generation.
Got it. And
I
so
think,
just to push on this a little bit. So you don't think AI will ever get to the point where, after analyzing the architecture of, I don't know, every project ever created on GitHub, that it will become good at taming complexity itself, and perhaps, better than humans at figuring it out? And you don't think that that's a point where at some point Devin will be better than the best human architect?
I won't say it won't, because I know I can certainly see scenarios where it might. Honestly, everything can effectively be turned into a process. And if it can be turned into a process, it can be automated. The question is, will Devin at that point have the specific capability of understanding relevance to human beings of a particular solution? And this kind of gets back into the other side of intent, and that is that right now, and for the immediate foreseeable future, I think intent is going to be a lot harder to tame than we really think it is, because it's essentially something where you are saying, I want my magic box, and I don't want to think. And so at some point, you're going to end up irrigating that thought process off to something else, to a device, to a thing. And, you'll just get stupider, because you're not going to be exercising the brain. Now, that's not to say that a computer can't do that. It certainly can. And just as I said, outside of some really interesting territory, when you start getting into Kurt Gödel and incompleteness theorem, and all that. For the most part, we get to a stage where we're saying if we are at a stage where we are delegating everything, then we have nothing.
Yeah.
And some people like that, but that kind of gets back to the concept of Odysseus and the land of the lotus eaters. That is the kind of society where you end up with, because nobody is actually learning how to do anything, because it can all be done at the press of a button. And I think society will collapse before that actually happens. So,
Okay, that's a lot there. Wait a minute, we've gone to the collapse of society pretty quickly. So I guess the question, I mean, because
well, I'm not
because
necessarily
I'm trying
saying
to.
it's imminent, but I am saying that
No,
once you basically once you basically give up intent and give up
right.
the desire to create something that's unique and novel and yours, then
Right.
essentially you're giving up a lot of what it means to be human.
That's I think I'm hearing the artist in you right now, Kurt. Is that right? I mean,
That's probably
because I
true.
think what I'm hearing, because I think
The
what I'm
purpose of an
hearing
artist is
is,
to basically make
yeah.
other people afraid. It
That's not.
truly.
I've never heard that definition before.
Well, I mean, the purpose of an artist is to is actually to speak to the emotions of people.
Right.
Because what you're dealing with as art is basically highly subjective, but it is usually intended to achieve a response.
Yeah.
And that response, could be, oh, that's cute. I really love that it's a pink unicorn. Or, oh God,
Yeah.
that's disgusting. Why did you even think about doing that? But what you've done as an artist is that you've basically received the response that you intended to do. And there's that intent all over again.
Right.
But so yes, I think there's probably part of that artist inside of me that's going, okay, once you no longer have that ability to press people's buttons, then why do art?
Yeah. But I mean, but for someone like me who has zero artistic ability, I mean, the ability to press a button and be able to form what I was imagining. I know you're saying lots of iteration there, all of that stuff, but and for again, I probably creating a massive new web application right now would if I could do that with a push of a button. I don't really see the downside of that. I mean,
I
because I'm not giving up on my intent. I'm not giving up on my desire to, sort of impact the world, or in the case of art, to, provoke an emotional response in people. I've just removed all the friction from that process from me. I now can play and, pretend to be an artist too, because now I have these tools that give me the ability to do things that used to take a lot of. I mean, it's like I imagine. I'm not an artist, but I imagine being an artist is a lot like being a programmer, where you have to spend years and years getting the skills to use different paintbrushes and figure out the techniques and all of that stuff. And
yeah
that's not. I would assume that's not the fun part of art anyway. That's kind of like the necessary, learning how to ski. It's the necessary stuff that you have to get through before you can get to the fun stuff.
yeah. I mean, I think that to a certain extent that's true. When you think about art is the process of applying technology to intent, to generate an artifact. There's a reason that
Yeah.
um, artifact actually means a done piece of art, is what it comes out to actually. And keep in mind that 100, 500 years ago, 600 years ago, the notion of a camel hairbrush was considered
Yeah.
to be high technology. The
Right.
notion that you could basically say, I have enough of an infrastructure base where I can basically encase and encase hair that can then be
Yeah.
pointed and shaped to be able to use certain different pigments, which have to be
Yeah.
compounded, which have to be, which essentially there's a base technology that has to exist. If you have that, then, as an artist, you're basically using the technology that you have available at the time to express your intent. Now, you do podcasts, and that podcast is a form of art. It is something where you are working to organize and shape using the tools that you have available to you, often in conjunction with other people, to generate an artifact that can then be distributed so that you can elicit a response.
Yeah.
So yes, you're an artist, and I think most people actually are. It's just they conflate that with, are you a good artist? And that's a little bit different. Because a good artist is basically someone
well, Kurt,
who's been
you've both
doing it
made
for
me
long
feel
enough to know the
much
tools.
better about myself. That's awesome. Thank you for that. You've made me feel like an artist today, so I feel much better about everything.
You're much welcome.
Well, let me ask a so closing question. Let me ask, because you've expressed a lot of skepticism about generative AI, and about maybe people are misconceptualizing how they should be using the technology right now. I'm curious about, are there places where you're super optimistic about generative AI and about how it will improve our lives? Do you think that do you think it will have a substantial impact on the world in a positive way? Or do you think it's just kind of like it's being so massively overhyped that there's not a lot of value in spending time working with the technology?
Yeah. I think it really depends upon what you want to get out of it.
Yeah.
I said this initially when back about 5 years ago, when I started watching what was going on in the neural net space. What you're producing is tools. Generative AI is basically a technology that's intended primarily for creators. And creators are going to use this technology to accomplish things that they could only dream of being able to produce before, because it requires a high degree of competency in a particular skill set. It requires a high degree of financial investment to make sure that you have the tools available. It requires a high degree of time investment to be able to accomplish things. And for the most part, these things, we talk about tools again and the relationship of tools or technology to art. But we also talk about these tools as, they tend to be gating factors. If I don't have the tools I need to be able to make a movie, and I don't, I'm a lousy photographer, but I'm pretty good at being able to generate, with the existing tools, generate something that I can turn into a narrative. And that, to me, is actually one of the things that I see generative AI being significant for. Because, in essence, one of the things that define us as human beings is our ability and our love of the narrative. We are all basically storytellers. We're all basically wanting to either live within a story that we can embellish with our own stories, or we are people that want to create stories. We want to create worlds. And that is something that I think generative AI is especially adept for. I can create something that has music, that has voicing, that has audio, that has visualizations and something that appears real. I can string those together to be able to form a story. I can use those to basically say, here is a world that does not exist before, but now does. And that, to me, is really magical. And it's a lot more magical than trying to use this to be able to put people out of a job. Because I don't think that's actually going to happen. I really don't. I think that what's happening is that what you're doing is you're empowering the creator. And I think that is actually what kind of scares people that are primarily money focused, because the creators also, once they control the narrative, can do things that people that are just financing them in the background can't. They're basically, a financier, does an important part. They basically say, okay, we can basically help to create something, from the standpoint of making sure that the people who are capable of doing the creation can in fact accomplish what they need to be able to produce an artifact that can then be monetized. And that, by
So
itself
I
is a
think,
really
yeah,
okay. So let me finish this thought. That by itself is
yeah,
actually
please.
a pretty profound notion, because if you go in and say you can monetize, or that you can essentially use this creative process to then empower the creators and their audience to be able to then, create the iterative cycles, that's very beneficial. But if you look at it as, look, I'm basically just looking to reduce my head count because I'm wanting to make a
Right.
profit, it's not going to be a technology that is going to work for you.
And that's a good thing.
And that's a really good thing.
Right.
I think, you can talk about business and business people and the like, and I have nothing wrong with it. I run my own business. I understand all of the complexity that's involved in that. But at the same time, I think that too many people get so caught up in the process of not creation, but essentially the acquisition of money, that they
Yeah.
lose sight of the fact that ultimately, the purpose of an organization, of a corporation in particular, is to do things for people, is to provide stuff that people can use. If you're not doing that, then you're essentially toxic. And we've got a lot of toxic organizations in work right now, and I think that as you see AI being used in that manner, it's ultimately pretty destructive. So we talked briefly about the end of civilization as we know it. I don't think that's going to happen, but I do think that at some point, a lot of our existing assumptions coming from the last 100 years are now being upended, and it's going to cause a whole lot of rethinking about what people do with their lives. So,
Well, I want to thank you for your time today. And I and I also want to ask you, what's the best way for people if they want to sign up for your newsletter? How do they do it? What's the best way to stay
the
up with the
simplest
stuff
way
that you're
right
working on?
now is just get up on LinkedIn, type in Kurt
Okay.
Cagle, and it'll
Okay. I can do
pop
that.
it in, and then I've got a button on my site.
Nice.
I do have some other newsletters that I keep ignoring. I'm a pretty good speaker and writer. I'm a lousy business person, so I tend to do something and then say, "Oh, but look at this shiny over here." I'm really bad as an ADHD person, but that is the price you pay if you're one of these people that kind of goes bing, 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 bing. That's that. Oh well, I can live with that.
Well, thank you. And any closing thoughts?
Just I think I would, in evaluating all this technology, and keep an open eye, but also, or keep an open mind, but also at the same time understand that the value of a confabulator is to create, and
Yeah.
it can create useful things. You can use it for summarizing, you can use it for abstracting to a certain extent. You can even kind of convince it that it happens to be a database today and make it actually, act like a database for at least a little while before it forgets. But, the key thing is to basically go in with it and say, okay, that is what this does. If we understand that, then everything else should kind of logically flow from that.
Thank you for joining us for the OpenAI Changes Everything podcast, where we explore how OpenAI is transforming the future of humanity. Please remember to subscribe to ensure that you receive future episodes.